I am co-director of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence with Jen, who you heard from earlier. Oh, there are the slides, thank you. And I am excited to be presenting with Marisa Gerstein-Pineau from Frameworks about framing racial equity and adolescence. So what we're going to do is essentially build upon what we heard in part one of today. Megan, if you could go to the next slide. So I think the first question that we should all be asking is, why do we want to connect adolescence and racial equity? Megan, if you advance, I think there may be some text. Actually, if you go back a slide, I'm not sure where the text went, but I can tell you what it says. And I'll also share a resource that has this information in it. It's important that we are connecting adolescence and racial equity in addition to all of the reasons that you heard about from Nat and from Adriana and from Jen. When we're talking about racial equity in particular, equitable systems and supports during adolescence are critical for healthy development. So it's really important that we are providing equitable systems and supports, which supports their ability to contribute to a stronger social fabric. We also know that adolescents are exploring their place in the world and they're primed for civic engagement, which makes them key partners in dismantling racism. So in thinking about adolescents, not just as sort of passive kind of targets of racism, they also can play an active role in anti-racist work. And also important is that public policies that are intended sometimes to address racial inequities don't always consider the needs of adolescents. So we really need to think carefully about, how do we message around policies that are going to be supportive in reducing inequities for adolescents in particular. Next slide. Thanks, Megan. So we have, or I'll say I have, and my colleagues have sort of grappled with some of these framings, and I'll give you two examples of where it's shown up, and I will post links to these resources in the chat once I turn it over to Marisa. I was on the consensus committee that produced the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report in 2019 called The Promise of Adolescence, Realizing Opportunity for All Youth. Chapter 4 in the report is called Inequity and Adolescence, and it addresses disparities in multiple outcomes across 4 youth-serving sectors that are featured in the rest of the report. That includes education, justice, health, and child welfare. The chapter includes a multi-page table that documents differential outcomes across race, ethnicity, biological sex, family income, and sexuality. And one of the challenges, as you can imagine, in a chapter like this one, is that highlighting disparities can reinforce a deficit narrative about particular groups. So whether that be minoritized racial or ethnic or sexual identity groups, for example. So it's, essentially it's a key responsibility when it comes to framing around equity is remembering that we can't let the data speak for themselves. So the way we addressed it in this chapter is that the remainder of the chapter, as well as the introduction, documents specific sources of disparities in outcomes like family wealth and income, coupled with segregation by race and income at the neighborhood level, disparate institutional responses to adolescence that happen in the education system and the justice system and so on, as well as prejudicial treatment of adolescents by adults and peers. Those are not the only sources of inequity, but we honed in, because we were grounding it in available science, we honed in on those 3 driving factors that lead to disparate outcomes and contribute to disparities. So in a moment, you'll hear me sort of introduce the core principles of framing around racial equity. One of them includes the need to be thorough and specific in framing racial equity. Chapter 4 in the NASM report offers an example of how to do this. It goes beyond racial equity, but it addresses broad categories of inequity in adolescence. The second example, which is pictured on the right, comes from the first report from our National Scientific Council on Adolescence, called The Intersection of Adolescent Development and Anti-Black Racism. We were very intentional about grounding the report in the science of adolescence. We know that Black youth are often viewed as a special population, and they are often subjected to a deficit lens focused on shortcomings and problems. So it was important for us to remind readers that there are core developmental needs and strengths that all adolescents have, so that Black youth could be included in sort of all adolescence. So we connected the report to salient features of adolescence, like needs related to identity development and belonging, as well as to exploration and agency. In addition, we were intentional about why we focused on Black youth. We defined terms like racism and anti-racism. We attended to processes at multiple levels, so interpersonal racism and structural racism. And also critically important, we reminded readers throughout the report of the rich diversity that exists among Black youth. So, and we explained why we need to sort of talk at the collective level as well as recognize heterogeneity in Black youth communities. All right, next slide, please. So when we think about how to talk about racial equity in adolescence, these points come from a resource that was developed and published by Frameworks in 2021, and we will share this resource out with everybody. There's kind of 3 buckets of categories with some specific guidance for each of those. So connecting to powerful values, we'll talk today about the value of opportunity for all, emphasizing community connections, which we heard about earlier, and connecting to anti-racist advocacy and engagement to healthy development. Spotlighting experiences is another critical sort of point of guidance for framing. That includes amplifying the voices of youth of color, talking about supporting parents. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, being thorough and specific. We must responsibly explain the causes and consequences of inequity rather than allowing people to draw their own conclusions about, individuals being sort of the source of the disparities or being at fault for any disparate outcomes. So we need to name the causes of disparities, and we need to explain racism as institutional and not just interpersonal, although of course it operates at the interpersonal level as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Marisa, who is going to talk about some of the examples of these frames. And Megan, I think if you go back maybe one slide, we might have bumped over one.
Great, thank you, Joanna. And what Joanna and I are going to do next is alternate some of the recommendations that came out of what I posted as the first link in the chat that organizes a larger group of recommendations. We're talking about race and equity in adolescent to sort of more bite-sized chunks. And then we're breaking down some of that because we could talk for a much longer period of time about every single one of those recommendations. But I'm going to start by talking about the 2 values that are recommended that are based on our research around framing that you've actually seen already in some of the work that Jen and Adriana presented. And I just want to set it up by talking about what we mean when we're talking about values. And what we're saying when we talk about values are these ideas, these sort of enduring beliefs that help orient how people want to think about and behave when they hear particular pieces of information. So I prefer to think of it as the why does this matter frame. It's what brings people in, gets them interested, raises the salience of a particular social issue or social problem. And these are embedded throughout our culture. And as we know from our work, some values work better for talking about certain issues, and some values work better for talking about other issues. And actually, you saw that when Nat showed that graph of how to talk about child mental health. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about opportunity for all, which again, you already saw, but just embedding this language of opportunities and the fact that everyone needs opportunities, that this needs to be inclusive, that it needs to be opportunities that all young people have access to, and not just that these opportunities are available, right? So because the implication of opportunities being available is that then you have to sort of, as an individual, reach out and grab them, but they need to be accessible. They need to be something that that young people can actually access, that are readily available, that are there for them, not to have to reach alone, but in interaction with the systems and institutions that they work with. And opportunity is a really great value to use in shorter communications because it does signal so much to people. It is something that people really hold dear as part of our sort of cultural understanding of who we are as a country, right? We're the land of opportunity. So if you go to the next value. So the second is community connections. So in addition to opportunity, Americans have a really strong sense of valuing community in whatever way that means to them. It can be kind of a vague term, but what it does, again, is it brings people into the discussion around adolescence. So when you talk about the importance of adolescent development, because it benefits all of us through the community connections that they develop and are able to maintain, is another really great way to talk about why we need to care about adolescent development. And then, of course, using community connections overlaps with discussions about young people's engagement and their advocacy, and the importance of that in terms of young people being a force for good and joining in on social movements, et cetera. And so again, it's something that it cues something with people, with members of the public, that really gets them engaged in this conversation. So I think Joanna's going to take the next slide. So if we can move to that. Oh, and sorry, I forgot. You can put these together, right? So if you go to the next slide, you don't have to stick to one value or another. You can put them together. And that is actually the case with every frame we recommend. Obviously, in a shorter communication, you might need to just take one frame or another, or the type of communication who you're talking to. Some frames will work better than others, but ideally across all of your communications, you're going to embed as many frames as possible. So sorry, now it's to turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you, Marisa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so going back to the one of the sort of guiding principles in terms of spotlighting experiences, that's important in terms of the work of framing, in part because audiences can relate to experiences. And there's other reasons that it's important as well. So one of the ways to do this when you're talking about racial equity and adolescence is to amplify the voices of youth of color. In the frameworks guidance that Marisa put the link in the chat to, they, I think, really nicely talk about the importance of this that is tied actually back to the developmental science. And that is that adolescents are maturing cognitively in ways that help them appreciate the influences and complexities of race and racism in new ways. So when we talk about racial equity during adolescence and during adolescence with a CE and among adolescents with an NTS, we need to help incorporate the concerns, perspectives, and ideas of those who are the content experts. That includes the young people who are most impacted by racial inequities. Centering youth voices in this way also helps to push back against the perception that youth of color are one monolithic group, which I talked about earlier. In fact, and we mentioned this in the National Scientific Council report on anti-Black racism and adolescent development, that sharing a racial identity, so identifying with the label of Black or African American, does not guarantee that youth have similar perspectives on problem solutions or even what race means to them in their own lives. So when young people are given space to talk about their own experiences, they're more likely to then portray the full range of their identities. They may speak to challenges, but they also can speak to joy. So the joy of being part of their racial or ethnic group, as well as aspects of themselves that aren't about race. On the slide, what you see there visually is a link to a Twitter post. And I want to put in a quick plug for the Center for Developing Adolescent podcast episode called "This Is Me, Race and Identity in Adolescence." And there are two young women who both identify as Black who talk about their experiences of being Black and women in STEM fields. And we have a sort of middle adolescent and an older adolescent or emerging adult. And you hear sort of a more holistic portrayal of their experiences, where Black is one part of their identity, being in STEM is one part of their identity, and you see the ways in which those identities really intersect in how they view themselves. So including direct youth voices when possible in communications about racial equity in adolescence is important for framing. So I will now pass it back on to Marisa to talk about one of the last specific examples of how we do some of this framing work.
Great, thank you. So if we can go to the next slide. Oh, so I think there was one just before this. Thank you. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was explanatory chains and the ways in which you can use these, especially when you're talking about racial disparities and institutional racism, et cetera, to take the knowledge that you have as somebody who is an expert in all of this and convey it in ways that are much more clear to people who don't have your knowledge, can't really easily access this information. And what you're doing is you're using a sequence. So you're talking about what affects what are the results of that, and what to do about it. And one of the things that I really love too about explanatory chains is that they make you slow down and really think through what it is, what the issue or problem is that you're trying to communicate by filling out this chain, because there's so many ways in which when we are experts on something, we're able to kind of use a shorthand in our heads and skip over certain parts so that it seems very obvious that if there's this cause, then the solution is that, or if there's this consequence, then we should obviously be doing this particular thing. And this really helps you slow down and think things through in ways that are much more clear for the people that you're talking to. So if you can just go to the next slide. So here's an example. I know there's a lot of text on here. I normally don't like to do text heavy slides, but again, because you want to be very explicit and concise and clear about what you're doing here, there's quite a bit of information. And I think we can actually send after this a blank version of this so that folks can go through and think about a particular issue that they're working on having to do with adolescence and fill this in. But this is an example of some work that's been done around race and racial inequities and the pandemic. Where you can see setting up what causes are and then what the consequences are and then what the solutions are in a very clear way that connect back to each other. I do, just as a side, want to say, and I know I do it here, I put in equity or inequity without defining it, but you always, always, always need to define what equity and inequities are, because members of the public have no idea what that word means. And of course, it's something that in our worlds, in health, education, development, et cetera, it's a word that's being increasingly used. But when you ask members of the public what they think equity means, they either say the value of their house or that we're talking about equality. So just make sure you're really clear about that. But here I started with sort of a high level cause, right? So talking about disadvantages such as racism, poverty, under-resourced, which we just talked about in the chat, schools that then create racial disparities. So if you're going to talk about racial disparities, you always need to say what is creating these disparities, because otherwise people just sort of default to types of thinking that we really want to avoid. So the reason racial disparities in educational outcomes by race occur is because, and this is where people tend to go, oh, maybe Black families don't value education like white families do, or, Black young people are just too concerned with music and peers, et cetera. So the explanations that people put people bring to mind and put on when they hear about disparities without explanation is really not unproductive, not where we want people to go. So that's a high level cause. And then you see a more proximate cause, sort of the next link in the chain, which is about specifically what's happening during the pandemic. And then as a consequence, how these two things combine to exacerbate obstacles to educational opportunities and learning for these particular group of young people. So having listed the causes and the consequence, then you get to a solution, which is, school systems should prioritize supports for young people of color and focus on providing social emotional learning. So this is not in this case, it's not a super precise solution, immediate solution. And I think you all can fill that in when you're talking about these types of issues because you have the deeper knowledge of what the immediate solutions are. But then there's a step even further out, just like there is a high level cause, there's a higher level solution about education systems needing to be redesigned. So this is an example of how you can actually walk people through how racial equity and inequities work so that they can really connect the dots in a way that they probably are not able to by themselves, or they will connect things to dots that we would just rather you don't connect to.